Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
I'm not going to say, how are you? Welcome to the First Hill unit of the Seattle King County League of Women Voters. We welcome the members of this unit, other league members, Horizon House residents who are always welcome, our 104-year-old national organization's mission is to defend democracy and expand and protect voting rights. Our membership coordinator, Sandra Bergen, in the back, will say a few words at the end of today's program. She asks that you sign our membership or guest list at the back table. We also extend a warm welcome to our guests from the University of Washington, whom you will know in a few moments. Between 2005 and 2020, 25% of local newspapers closed nationwide. In our state, that included 3 dailies and more than 24 weeklies. The League of Women Voters of Washington's intensive 2-year study of local news reporting in the state concludes this is imperiling our democracy and is seeking national league concurrence with the following position to support the survival of local news organizations across the country. Quote, "The League of Women Voters of the United States believes it is the responsibility of the government to provide support for conditions under which credible local journalism can survive and thrive. The League of the U.S. defines local news as accurate, in-depth coverage of government entities, including but not limited to city councils, county councils, county boards of commissioners, health departments, schools, and school boards. This will be before the National League Convention in D.C., June 27 to 30. League member Judy Hucka from Whidbey Island will be there and has agreed to come here for our July meeting to report on how the vote went. Plan to come back the third Monday. Now the panel will move to the front row to watch a video.
News is coming at you all day from every direction. But how informed are you and your neighbors about your own community, your school board, city council, or your public health facilities? Between 2005 and 2020, 1/4 of the nation's local newspapers closed, leaving 1,800 communities with no local news outlet. Many studies show these closures have had a significant impact on our democratic system of government. The truth is, local news is in crisis, and it isn't just a journalism problem. It's now a democracy problem. Our 10-member local news committee from across Washington state decided it was a problem in need of an investigation. The charge of the local news committee was to explore this national problem from a local perspective. We wanted to uncover if local news outlets were disappearing at the same rate as other states. If so, were Washington residents experiencing the same known impacts on democracy? Our 2-year study began with a deep dive into the national research that identified local news was on decline and having troubling impacts on communities across the country. We explored the research conducted by Dr. Penny Abernathy, an academic researcher who wrote the book, News Deserts and Ghost Newspapers: Will Local News Survive? In addition, journalist Margaret Sullivan contributed to our research with her book, Ghosting the News. These books and their data resonated with our committee. As League members, we cared about an informed electorate and good government. Anecdotally, we also were keenly aware of what was happening in our own hometowns. Newspaper outlets were changing ownership, newspapers were skinnier, and coverage was dwindling. We interviewed more than 50 stakeholders, from local journalists to politicians, national media figures to local news publishers. Our review included more than 500 documents, academic studies, newspaper articles, opinion columns, magazine articles, and other reports. We took the lead from Penny Abernathy and focused on specific areas of influence. We found evidence that the decline in local news resulted in fewer candidates running for office, as well as fewer citizens being motivated to vote. Also, the lack of local news saw greater political partisanship among communities because citizens were only consuming national partisan news outlets. We also uncovered research that suggested that the lack of local news resulted in fewer citizens engaged in civic events. We found research and anecdotal evidence that the loss of local news left citizens with less vital information about public health. And finally, we found research that suggested when a community does not have a reliable local news outlet, banks are likely to raise interest rates on municipal loans because there are no watchdogs to follow the money. We were determined to uncover vital, specific evidence about our statewide communities, so we spent more than 1,000 woman hours researching and analyzing local news as a variable and how it corresponds with other community issues. One specific project demonstrated how the decline in local news affected voter turnout in all the counties in our state. Other original research demonstrated how many of our local newspapers have declined in weight while prices have risen. Our efforts included tracking circulation and staffing trends within the state. We collected data that offered a comprehensive look at closures of newspapers and changes in ownership. We found that our state was experiencing a loss of local reporters at a greater rate than the national average. We also examined a variety of potential measures to support and protect local news, such as legislation, nonprofit ownership, community partnerships, and philanthropy. After our study was reviewed by our League of Women Voters State Board, we presented our findings to nearly every local league in our state. We invited more than 2,500 members from across our state to weigh in on our findings. Our discussions were rich and enlightening. Members agreed local journalism was fundamental to democracy, especially today. The League of Women Voters of Washington believes it is the responsibility of the government to provide support for conditions under which journalism can survive and thrive. Our members agreed with strategies from local tax breaks to subsidizing citizen access to local news. Our committee then drafted positions based on our members' consensus. Our board of directors adopted the positions, and they were ratified at our state convention in 2023. The positions, as presented, state that the League of Women Voters of Washington support local news as fundamental to democracy. These positions also encourage education that informs our young people about news and media literacy so they will understand the value of reliable local news to our community and our democracy. These positions also enforce the notion that control of content must remain with the news organization and not the government. As a result of these statewide efforts, the State League has advocated for one bill in our legislature that aligns with the position and is preparing to advocate for others. Through all of our efforts, we feel that our study that led to these statewide League of Women Voters positions have strengthened our ability to support local journalism and strengthened our democracy. We encourage you to review our report from the League of Women Voters of Washington because it's not just a journalism problem, it's a democracy problem. The League of Women Voters of Washington will submit these positions as an item for concurrence at the National Convention. Stay tuned for information on that in time for your program planning meeting. Thanks for listening.
We grew up with a paper boy tossing a folded newspaper on our porches. Old movies allow paper boys hawking newspapers on the street, and you saw the newspaper stand a couple of times on the film where you could get papers from all over. I had a chance to work in advertising at the Spokesman Review in Spokane right out of high school for advertising, where I had to count all the inches of advertising in the back of the newspaper. I also worked in Olympia during the legislature in the 80s, and there were a lot of reporters there. You don't see that now. Horizon House resident Neil McReynolds is a member of the University of Washington Communications Hall of Fame, based in part on his years in the newspaper business and the many individual awards he won, 30, as a result of his lifelong achievements in business, government, and civic activities. He's the former editor of the Bellevue American newspaper and has held many important positions in private industry and government, including press secretary to Governor Dan Evans, and we'll be hearing from him. Horizon House resident Mary Koch also majored in communications at the University of Washington, is the former Washington State editor of the Associated Press. She worked out of Seattle, Spokane, and Olympia, and covered events in British Columbia. Leaving AP, she joined her late husband as owners and publishers of the OMAC, Okanogan County Chronicle, a weekly newspaper in eastern Washington. Diana Kramer is the publisher of The Daily of the University of Washington and the director of student publications. She's a former executive director of the Washington Newspaper Publishers Association and former community newspaper publisher in Washington and Arizona. Her family's been in the community newspaper business for more than 100 years. Now we'll hear from the panel, who will highlight a few of the significant differences they've seen in news coverage in recent years. Now, you can either come to the lectern or stand and hold the mic, whichever you wish. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Joan. Well, first I want to commend the League of Women Voters for raising the issue and following through on this study. I think that's been very impressive. I've seen the video clip you just showed. I've seen that a number of times, and the message still comes across as very strongly, and I think that's really important. The message to be delivered. It couldn't get much attention on this subject just a few years ago, but it's glad to see it's been raised, and I commend the League for doing that. I'm here this morning because I'm concerned about the future of democracy as the League is, and the future of democracy as we know it today. It's more than a loss of newspapers. And I think that's really important, which I hate to see happen as an old newspaper guy, but it's I think the question that is posed as a title of this program today, after newspapers, how will you get your local news? That really captures it pretty well, and the importance of local news in our whole democratic process. When I attended the School of Communication at the University of Washington years ago, I learned that free press is a key factor in our country's democratic process. I minored in political science and heard a similar message here, just not as loudly and as frequently as I did in the communication school, but nevertheless, the message came through to me very loud and clear. However, that was an academic setting. However, that message didn't really have a meaning until I had a chance to get out in the real world and a full-time newspaper job at the Bellevue American. maybe a little history will help. Bellevue had become a city just 3 years earlier, just 3 years before I arrived, and it was just starting to see some explosive growth. And there were large developments were planned, houses being thrown up quickly, and young families with school-age kids moving over there. And those of you who've been around for a while remember those days, and it was really it's quite a movement taking place in the suburbs, and it's in the process of that whole thing. Cities were formed, not just Bellevue. Around Bellevue, there were 5 more municipalities were started in those days. Names like you hear about Medina and Clyde Hill and Hunts Point, Yarrow Point and Beaux-Arts, and those are all names today are very common. But in those days, they were brand new cities, and they elected city councils. They had, commissions, planning commissions, and what have you, all play an important role in this. And then there's, of course, the other special districts were created all because of this growth taking place. We had the sewer districts created, water districts created, all with elected officials and spending taxpayer money for various things. So these were all happening, starting at about, as I say, about the early, mid-1950s and taking place. And so. And so we, as a new person on the paper, I was beginning to learn about our responsibilities. And I had a boss there who was a longtime journalist, and he felt strongly about this idea about that we were an important part of the whole democratic process, and so we needed to act that way and really pursue these local government entities and to be sure we're reporting to our readers what was going on in local government, what issues were going to be impacting them, and we really got that message loud and clear from him, and we started doing that. But I still wasn't really there yet. But as these new districts were created, and we're trying to cover all this thing, and new municipalities creating, there's a lot of meetings going on, and we just didn't have time to cover them all. But our readers were continually challenging us to the fact that they want to know what was going on, what were these people doing to us, these newly elected city councilmen and new staff people for each of these municipalities or special districts, and they want to know how much it's going to cost them, and all the questions would normally run through people's mind. We were trying to cover this stuff, but we did, I think, a pretty good job of the larger ones. The smaller ones, we didn't. That was a challenge, keeping up with all these sewer districts, water districts, and small towns. But I think we did a reasonable job. But we had this constant demand that we really want to know what's going on in these. And so that was the challenge we had in those days. And so it really came through loud and clear that the public really wants to know what's going on, not just the big cities and the big headlines. And I tell you that story because I see that today. The demand for it, but nobody's really meeting that need as much as even in those days when we were just doing a fair job of covering the small towns. And Seattle Times did a great job on a lot of things, but they weren't really interested in covering small towns and especially service districts on the east side of Lake Washington. And they did a great job of covering when we got major controversies occurred. That was different. If somebody was caught embezzling money from the city or something like that, they got flooded with news media, both newspapers and radio and television. So there was definitely there. But that was mainly the big stuff. But all the rest of the stuff was going on in local government. That's where, and so I got the message very loud and clear. That was important. That message has stuck with me over the years, and encouraged people to do it. But it's been disappointing to see what kind of happened, and it really didn't start just with the social media and other things that are getting blamed for a lot of it. Started way back when advertising was shifted from newspapers to radio and television. And that was the electronic kind of the start of this whole thing. And that was a number of years ago. And now it's, of course, the pace has stepped up, and there is less of a need, and papers are dropping out. My old paper doesn't exist anymore. And it was one of the largest and the most successful newspapers in the state, but it lost all its much of its advertising, and and long after I left, it shut its doors. And so it's unfortunate. But anyway, that was happening, as you heard the statistics earlier today. That's happening all over across the country. And I think I'm glad that some people are stepping up to doing that. And I hope the league will continue to push our elected officials and others to do that. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to John.
Thank you, Neil. And next, Mary Koch.
As a journalist, I've worked in broadcast, print, and the online media. And back in the days when there were wires, even a wire service. In 1979, I left the Associated Press, which at that time was the largest news gathering organization in the world, to join my husband in publishing one of the smallest news organizations, a weekly rural newspaper. I personally covered everything from murder trials in the county courthouse to Easter egg hunts in the town park, school board meetings, city council, grocery store grand openings, and opening day of Little League. That was the late 20th century. I think of it as a golden era of weekly newspapers, not only ours, but across the country. Washington State in particular had a number of papers that were like ours, mom and pop operations, locally owned by professional journalists who were committed to their communities, not as cheerleaders, but as advocates. The best journalism is a reflection of the community, its beauty marks and its pimples. The newspaper that nurtured my soul, along with the soul of our community, is now a skeleton of what we had produced. It's not only smaller, but news coverage is scant. It's owned by some guy in North Dakota who visited only briefly when he bought it. As you saw in the video, my story is not unique. Newspapers like ours have been the bedrock of local journalism. Their demise is a symptom of the incredible cultural revolution we've been experiencing throughout this century. How do we recreate the informed citizenry that is essential to democracy? The news is not all bad, which is why I'm excited to have our guest panel with us today. And so I'm going to turn the rest of the program over to my longtime friend and colleague, Diana Kramer.
Thank you, Mary. I am excited to be here, and when I asked the students and John, the panel that I brought with me, if they would be willing to come and join me in this, they were excited to come. So I'm going to introduce them in a minute. I want to take just a minute to talk about the why behind some of what we're seeing today. And one of the reasons that newspapers are closing is because the advertising base consolidated and or moved online. I mean, I think about the towns that I published in and that Mary and John published in, and they had, a car dealer or two, and they had real estate companies, and they had an assortment of banks and a couple of hardware stores or more, and all those people advertised in the newspaper. And it supported a reporting staff that was large enough to cover pretty much everything that was going on in that town, pretty much like a coat of paint. You know, we did. And all that stuff that Mary read off, I have been there too. Yes, I have more hours in seats at public meetings than I'll probably ever recover from. But the other thing is, you could count on all of the influencers, people like you, the decision makers in the community, to have subscribed to the newspaper and to have read the same things. And so whether you went to church or you went to the school board meeting or you went to Little League, the people who influenced the thought in that community had pretty much all read the same things. And so that developed a commonality. We could talk to one another because although we didn't agree on everything, we agreed on pretty much quite a lot. And that's not to minimize the demographic groups who were not covered well. I mean, we should own that too. But the generation now that Lucas and Morgan are in, they get almost all of their content pushed to them by algorithm. It's online. And so if this has happened, I've looked for a shop vac, you know, and how to clean a gutter. And then all the advertising that comes up deals with gutter stuff, shop vac stuff, and don't even get me started on the horse supplement stuff, you know. That is all the content that is pushed my way. And so there's less and less. You could go to someone that you go out to lunch with someone that you know pretty well, and they haven't seen or read anything that you have seen or read. And that has caused, I think, more of a fractious society. The internet has allowed us to create communities around interests and not around geography. You have a unique situation here. We have a similar unique situation at the University of Washington where people live there, they're interested in things that are happening there, and so that makes things a little bit easier too. Demographically, the greatest generation that you all are members of, you all had the baby boomers, and we had the Generation X. They're a small group. They didn't think they could accomplish much. They didn't think they could change things. We changed things. We did. This group, Generation Z, is a huge group demographically, and they are organized. They care deeply about institutions, about the environment, and they are coming. Ready or not, they're coming. Okay. I'd like you to meet Lucas Amrine. He just completed a year as the editor-in-chief of the Daily of the University of Washington. He spent a year prior to that as the news editor, and he's a 2024 graduate with degrees in international relations and geography. This guy did a remarkable job as news editor, and I want to hear from him about that in a minute. So welcome, Lucas. Morgan Bortnick is the incoming news editor, and she's double majoring in law, societies and justice, and journalism and public interest communication. She covered many major stories this past year, and I'd like you to welcome Morgan as well. And, yes, John. John Tomasic is an experienced journalist. He's currently an artist in residence at the University of Washington Department of Communication and a senior fellow at the department's Center for Journalism, Media, and Democracy. He teaches several journalism and writing classes and directs a legislative reporting internship program at the State House in Olympia, and an international reporting program that this year has landed students at news outlets in India, Thailand, and Samoa. And I can't tell you how happy, relieved, and excited I am that he helps me at the Daily as the newsroom advisor. So please welcome John. So, Lucas, I'd like to start with you, and if you would take a minute, you can just sit right there and pass the thing back and forth. Tell us about what it was like for you to start reporting at the UW during the pandemic. So awesome, I know.
Thank you very much, Diana. Yes, so I started my time at the Daily in the fall of 2021, and so things were coming out of a full year of being remote. My first year at the University of Washington was done from Chehalis, Washington, in my bedroom. So I was very excited to come onto campus, and part of that was to get involved with something that would take me out of my dorm room because I had done a year of being inside. So I joined the school paper, and from that, it provided me the opportunity to, as we've talked about earlier, cover all of the exciting public university meetings that were happening. And so once kind of coming out of that full year of being remote, kind of my joy with the Daily was bringing it back to that local, hyper-local aspect of the paper, which was something that was hard to do when the people who were reporting for the Daily during the immediate part of the pandemic were all in their own bedrooms as well. And so I was part of that crop that came in and was able to bring things back to the University of Washington and go to those spaces, interview the people's, like the students on the student government committees and Senate and their legislative bodies, and cover the Board of Regents meetings. The things that don't sound very exciting when you list them to your friends, when you talk about what you've done on a Tuesday night. But I was always excited to be there and to write about them. And that led me then the next year to become the news editor and to kind of take what I had experienced being a reporter and to apply that more broadly and to kind of bring that community aspect back to the paper. That was something that I thought was incredibly important and something that naturally was lost during the pandemic. And then after another year, that was kind of an unexpected joy, but
And then we were afraid he was going to graduate.
yeah. So I came back for this last year, and as editor-in-chief, and all the circumstances of this year, it was very exciting to bring that, to hit the nail in the head of the community aspect of the paper. And so I am just very joyful to be passing the torch on to the next generation of Daily staffers and editors, who will bring that unique perspective that only student reporters can provide to the community.
Thanks, Lucas. In terms of context, it might be helpful for you to know that our newsroom is larger than the newsroom of the Seattle Times. I know. So where there used to be a full-time education reporter and one pretty much assigned to the UW, now they read our stuff and then they follow up when they think they need to, which we have chosen to take as a compliment and be flattered. It was but for a little while, but we're pretty good about that. So what Lucas has described is going from nobody to a few people, and now with Morgan in the newsroom and this new crop of students, we are fully back in community. The newsroom, the way it has been in there since 1891, which I'm super happy about. So Morgan, why don't you take it up and tell us what you've been doing this year, why you joined the Daily.
Let's see, this is on. Yeah, I joined the paper not even a year ago. Our current editor-in-chief, Piper Davidson, kind of reached out to me after we studied abroad in a creative writing program. She said, I think it's a great idea for you to join this community, you know, kind of meet everyone. That's where I met Lucas. And then I got into news writing because our news editor and now managing editor, Sophia Schwarzwalder, she texted me one night after I turned in my first news development article, and she said, you have to write for news. I think it would be a great place for you. And that is where I started my time as the statewide politics beat writer, where I got to travel to Olympia twice. One time, John drove me out there. Thanks again for that. Great ride at 7 in the morning. But yeah, my time there, I've covered a lot of the strikes that have going on with the academic student employees trying to get their contracts amended. I've covered some climate action groups and legislation lobbyists traveling around. I've covered a lot of the Seattle City Council, a lot of the new members, and then I've done some feature pieces on specific legislation that passed during the 2024 legislative session. So that was really fun getting to talk to everyone out there. I think that the newsroom is a great place. I know the community building that Lucas has done has been amazing. I kind of joined right as this was happening, so I kind of jumped into it when there was a lot of people in the newsroom, and I kind of I didn't know anything else. I could have never guessed that there weren't always 10 people in there at once. So it's a great place to be. I found lots of my lifelong best friends in there. So I'm happy to pick it up where he has carried us.
Thanks, Morgan. So there's often some confusion about the difference between printing and publishing. And the Daily we consider it a daily newspaper, a daily news organization, because we're generating content, publishing content almost every day. We don't print very much. And so as we have evolved from a news organization that relies on a manufactured component, the printed newspaper, to something that's online, we've had to really think about our business model, how we're going to generate money, where the money's going to come from. That's pretty much what I do all the time. And we've had to think about what things are really worth. So in the manufacturing model days, it was you have your expenses, and then your return on investment, and then a profit, and then you figure out how much you need to charge for advertising. Business people are laughing, I know. Now it's, what is this worth? Because the online costs are pretty low. And we've evolved, I've finally gotten the advertising staff to recognize, we got to charge more for this because this is all we're doing to make money. And so we have newsletters that we mail out 3 newsletters a week, 60,000 people, 50% open rate. The advertising in that is going to be seen, and it is worth X amount of money. So that's how we're doing it. There are a lot of other models, and I'm going to ask John to jump in and take it away.
Thank you, Diana. It's an honor to be on this privilege and to be talking to you about what can sometimes be a kind of gloom and doom kind of topic, especially these days. There are many different models. First I should say, the title of this panel is After Newspapers, Where Will You Get Your Local News? I think maybe it should be After Newspapers, Who Will Be Writing Your Local News, and what kind of local news will you be getting? Because there's so much demand, as members of the panel have said. More people are reading the news every day now than ever before in history, and that includes local news, if they can find it. And these students are part of the solution. There's many ideas out there floating around about what to do about local news. The League of Women's Voters is part of the big blob of organizations and deep thinkers and researchers who are trying to figure out what exactly the problem is and how to solve it. And these students are so excited about journalism. They're young. According to our kind of metrics, like what's their job, what's their future, how much money are they going to make, these are not their metrics, which I'm happy to say because then we'd be in trouble. Their metrics are, I want to be a part of the community. I want to make a difference in my community. I love seeing my name in print. I love being part of the internet, et cetera, all these things. And there's so much passion in the newsroom at the Daily, and there's so much passion in the classes, the courses that I teach among the young people. And if there's passion among the young people, then there's a lot of hope for the future, I think. And local news is part of that. There are a lot of different models now going on, and the fact that we're here talking about this and the fact that there's so many different models, how to make money, how to produce content, how to support local news. Is it nonprofit? Is it profit? Is it for-profit? Is it a hybrid organization? Is it an outlet? Or is it an organization, a national organization, a nonprofit that has people in every state? These are all on the table. More innovation is going on now than ever before. And basically, I think that the example of our university-funded and ad-funded students doing journalism, the fact that they were so, that their reporting was such a big part of the local news ecosystem over the past year, whether it was climate change, the Israel-Palestinian protests, encampments, sports, whatever it is, a lot of the local news journalism here in Seattle and the metro area and in Washington State, they refer to what these guys are reporting, and they're reporting their original reporting because they're on the ground, they're asking their own questions, their own organic questions, their follow-up questions. They're choosing the stories they want to follow based on what they think is important and what the community thinks is important at UW and in Seattle and in the University District and in Washington State. That shows that the local news system can be supported in many new ways. And I think university students and university publications are a part of that solution. There's other great reasons for hope, and I think that show the same trend. And that trend is that there was a really bad time for local news. I would say about 10 years ago is really where it, or maybe 5 years ago is where it really hit its nadir. I think we were going through all these cycles of denial, anger, despair, lack of ideas, a lot of people exiting the profession. And that has given way to a lot of innovation, a lot of new ideas, a lot of acknowledgement of the problems and really resolve and digging into the problems and finding out exactly what the problems are. And mainly they have to do with local funding for local journalism. And there are many bright spots on that horizon. Hybrid journalism, whether it's profit and for-profit and nonprofit, is working in some respects. There's a lot more collaboration between local news outlets and national outlets, or a series of local news outlets. Universities are becoming part of the solution. University of Iowa, I think it was Iowa State or University of Iowa, bought two local newspapers. And
University of Iowa.
University of Iowa, and now they're running these local papers in Iowa with their own reporters and editors. So that's just part of, I think there's a lot, and you can see coverage changing. There's a lot of recognition that local news, hyper-local news, is the undergrowth in the forest. It doesn't often awe observers, but without it, nothing else grows. All of the national news depends on local news reporting, hyper-local news reporting, original reporting. And AI will not change that, artificial intelligence, and Google won't change that. And I think that the wide recognition of its importance in the system is starting to really generate money and change and big ideas. The online news law in Canada is actually forcing platforms like Facebook and Google to share their profits with the news outlets that they have basically stole from for years. And look at Washington State. We passed a bill to start funding local news and hiring young journalists. The Murrow Fellowship, Washington State University, is running. 2 of UW's alumni have now become local journalists on that funding, state funding. Public funding is gaining. And there's also new laws and public policy recognition that we can't let the algorithms kill our local news, that we need more local news, and we can defend against disinformation, and we can set up different kind of guardrails. Anyway, all of that is happening, and it just to me shows that we're in a difficult time, a changing time, but we're already on the upswing. So a little less doom and gloom, and look at these shining faces over here. There's a lot of future.
Thank you, John. Something that Canada did that John alluded to, and Australia has done the same thing, is they have required the technology companies to reimburse the originators of the content that they've stolen over the years. What the United States needs to do to have a similar law here is we need newspapers need an exemption to antitrust laws, so that the publisher of the Dallas Morning News and the Portland Oregonian and the Seattle Times and the New York Times, everybody can get together in one room and negotiate with the technology companies. They're international in scope. And the Dallas Morning News publisher, Seattle Times publisher, will not ever have the required weight to negotiate successful with these international companies. That, to me, is the single most important thing that could happen, is put us on, give us a break. We're not afraid of competition. We've never been afraid of competition. But don't send us in there completely hamstrung. So that's one thing. It's 11:19. I'm keenly aware I got to wrap up by 11:20. I'm so sorry we didn't have time for questions. Okay, we're going to have questions. Yes, ma'am.
Let's keep it to questions for the panel, not your own personal thing, because it's so valuable to us to have them with us. Thank you.
Mike runners.
Excuse me. Yeah, I was going to ask, are any of these people here paper boys? We need one more mic runner. Okay, and Madeline.
What do you want?
I'm Barbara Ray, and I have a question. Have you at the UW applied to be a journalist with the Guardian, for instance, to give you some international connection? They have journalists all over the world. And the other thing I'd like to ask, has anybody noticed that since Cascade took over PBS, they have a 10-minute or 5-minute news which is of local interest, and it's quite poignant. So if they have changed their style enormously, and if you haven't noticed it, every day, every hour, there is, have you noticed it? Yeah. And it's totally relevant. And if they and you can find a way to be funded, they spend an awful lot of time asking for funds. End of my questions.
Thank you. I think getting international experience, we do have opportunities for international experience through some of the programs at the UW. There's a foreign intrigue program, but we can certainly follow up with the Guardian. Thank you very much. Questions?
How can I subscribe to your papers?
We don't charge for subscriptions, and I'm glad you asked this question because we get about $400,000 a year from student fees. And part of that is we believe that if students are paying for this through their student fees, that it should be available to them for free. anyone can look at our website, dailyuw.com. On there, you can subscribe to our newsletter, and we would love to have you as a newsletter subscriber. Thank you.
Joan, I'm sorry, but I have to break your rule. I'd like to give the young people encouragement for what they are doing with an example. In the mid-'70s, the Magnuson Park used to be Sandpoint Naval Air Station, and the Naval Air Station was about to give up their property. And what happened was that a group of private plane individuals heard about it, and they said, good, we're going to make a private airplane airport out of it. Well, the local newspapers picked it up. It wasn't the New York Times. It was the University Herald. It was, of course, the PI, probably the Daily as well, and the local people, not the pilots, but just the communities, Laurelhurst, Windermere, View Ridge. They rose up in arms because of what they heard, what they read in the papers, and we defeated the pilots, so to speak. Today we have Magnuson Park. Of course, Senator Magnuson came into the picture, many others as well. But it was the papers which mobilized the community. So don't give up. Thank you.
Thank you. We had a question over here. Oh, he's right here.
I've heard that. I heard you talk about the University of Iowa and that there's some universities. How prevalent is that? Would you say there are a tremendous number of universities taking this on, or just a few?
Well, there are a few. We could not do that. The University of Iowa Student Media Department is completely separate from the university, although they collaborate with them. So that guy has his own money. I could not figure out a way to pay for that. But if someone wanted to, who was close enough, and the situation in Iowa was that it was just 15, 20 miles from campus, and so it was easy to get students back and forth. There is more of history. The University of Arizona took over the Tombstone Epitaph, and there have been like laboratory newspapers that were community newspapers that were taken over by a university journalism department. We could support something like that if it was close enough. But there are other models too. I just heard about the University of Iowa last month at a conference that I was at, and the community loves it, the students love it. They kept their existing staff. The owner just wanted to retire and wanted to get his newspapers into a good home. And Jason ended up taking 2 of the man's 4 newspapers. So, and since then, people have just come out of the woodwork,
So you talked about public universities. I wonder if there are any private universities. I'm thinking of Syracuse, for one, that had a tremendous J department for a long time, and then they made it into a communications department, and then may have weakened their J end of it. But have you heard anything coming from private universities doing this?
I haven't heard of anything yet, but that's not something that I'm focused on.
No.
It's like, oh, that's a cool thing, and hearing about it, but I've got to keep my own nose to my own grindstone.
A major concern of mine is the decline of investigative journalism. And in the model that you're talking about, what are the ways of preserving and enhancing the vital function of investigative journalism?
That is such a good question. We do some investigations at the UW, and the way our funding comes to us, it's not through student government, it's through the Services and Activities Fee Committee, so that there's really no chance for student government or somebody to shut us down. Records are hard to get. It takes a long time. Our quarters are 13 weeks long, 10 weeks really. 10 weeks long. So to do an investigation takes more time, but the students are figuring out ways to roll that from quarter to quarter and make sure that those really important investigations happen.
I know that there's a lot of very successful investigative projects going on, like ProPublica. And I also know that there's a lot of funding interest in investigative projects that can go across national and state lines. And I know also that there's a growing awareness that those kind of investigative stories, they take a long time to produce, a lot of man hours, a lot of woman hours, person hours. And they also, you have to have legal backing, lawyers on call often. But those stories bring in all kinds of readers and they make your outlet successful. And so they're starting to see we should do more of that stuff because that's what the community wants.
I just have one last thing to ask you. Is this the time, since there is always money in Seattle, how about finding someone who wants to set up a trust like The Guardian?
How about it? I'm not opposed. We do some fundraising through the Daily Fund for Excellence. It's how I get money to send our a photographer and sports editor to cover away football games. It's oh my goodness, last year the UW football team's success just about broke us, but we made it happen. But I am starting to organize now with our advancement people at the university to create an endowment. They think that we could potentially raise, and I'm not putting the arm on you now, could potentially raise $2.5 to $3 million, which would would fix our inequities in our pay structure or pay for the publisher's role. We don't know, but we're going to be working on that over the next 2 or 3 years. And if we could accomplish something like that, oh my goodness, what an amazing thing that would be.
Can I just bring up, can I just bring up the elephant in the room here? Sinclair is gobbling up news organizations all over the country. What can be done about that? To me, that's an enormous danger to our democracy.
Well, yes. And Alden Capital is I never thought that I would live to see the day that Gannett was one of the good guys in print. But Alden Capital, I support some public funding mechanisms for local news coverage. I don't think if you're a hedge fund and your primary focus is just extracting every dime you can, I don't think you should get 1 red cent. So I agree with you. I'm not sure what can be done because we have a free market thing, I don't know.
There are some private individuals who are inheriting money in the question.
I'm going to find out what your name is. It's 11:30. I know you have to move on. I want to thank you for your time and attention. And I know there's another group. Some people have to leave. The League of Women Voters is having a thing in here. We can take our little group out here. We'd love to meet and visit with you more if you have time. Thank you so much for having us.